All right, let's turn to the mailbag for question number 2. This is a question I've gotten from several people because it's obviously a contentious issue. Hydroxychloroquine. The president himself has touted this drug as a potential silver bullet for COVID-19. Is there anything to it? My answer? Well, let me answer it quickly. I don't think there's anything to it. Let me explain why, and let me give you an alternative that I think is better that you can consider in your considerations, okay? The thing about this is once it becomes politicized, once it becomes a big question, and once people are saying, I think this works, and then other people are saying just automatically, I don't think it works, just because the president says it doesn't mean it's wrong, okay? He can be right. A stop clock can be right twice a day, right? So we've got to look at the evidence and say, is there evidence for hydroxychloroquine? Unfortunately, there is not, in my opinion. And I have experience with looking at reams of papers, and you can hear about all these things, about all these studies on this side, studies on that side, and pretty quickly your head starts to spin. Now, I have experience in this area because it's the questions about evolution and faith that I constantly am answering, because I've asked those questions myself. How could evolution fit with God as creator? Okay, that's been a huge question looming over my entire life. And I've answered it different times depending on the time when you ask me. And I've collected evidence, so I've avidly read papers about this and tried to figure out, okay, who's right about this? And people can still argue about it. A paper will never shut someone up. Okay, a paper will just give someone reason to argue more. And I've seen that happening in evolution and creationism light, which is intelligent design. I say that with having looked, and it might sound like I'm dismissive. I did not dismiss this at all. I've devoted more of my life to asking these questions than probably any other scientific question. But I come down on the line of, I think evolution is the way that God created life. In fact, God gave life the ability to subcreate, to have some of God's creative power delegated to it. Okay, you can see how I can get off on this really, really fast. My main point is not to convince you one way or the other on this issue, but just to show you that big questions like this are part of the joy and frustration of science, because you can always find someone who's disagreeing. And so if you want to search for that someone, you can find them. By the way, I think that the only way to answer these big questions is with big pieces of writing, and that's one reason why I wrote a whole book about why I think evolution was the way God created and a good and orderly way to create from a certain perspective. That's where my book, A World from Dust, comes in. You can go to Amazon, and that's the only time I'm going to mention it on these podcasts, okay? But the point is, there's almost as much data about hydroxychloroquine. Could we say that there's a possibility that it works? And its efficacy is a big question like this. So I found myself using my similar kind of tools where I sift through a lot of data and try to say, what is the data that really matters here? One of the things to realize about hydroxychloroquine is not that G.K. Chesterton had this famous quote about Christianity. It hasn't been tried and proven false. It just has been found difficult and left untried, okay? That is not the way it's been for hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine has been tried and found ineffective. I know that you might debate this, but I've seen the weight of the studies, and the weight of the studies that I trust that look like they're done right comes down to the fact that I say I think it's a dead end. I say that with all humility. I don't know for sure. And I think if people want to take it prophylactically, people took it prophylactically for malaria in Burundi all the time. I'm not going to argue against that. I'm just going to say I don't think it helps. And I haven't seen evidence that says it does. Notice that I always mention the mechanism. I always think it through. And if you have a simple, straightforward mechanism for a drug, I'm more likely to believe that that drug works. If you have a more convoluted mechanism, then I'm going to require more evidence to say that drug works. And the thing about HCQ is that it has a more convoluted than a direct mechanism. It's there to stop endocytosis. It does work against malaria, it does work against this general process, but it's a general process, not a specific target for this particular virus. Because its mechanism is not very specific or targeted to the specific point where this virus is causing problems, I'm going to be skeptical of it. The other thing is lines of attack. This is from March 27 in Science Magazine, was written well before that, a couple weeks before that. On this figure, they say, we're going to try hydroxychloroquine. And they did. They published it. So let me zoom in on that. Let me show you. Chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine were listed as things to try. Repurposed drugs. We know it works for another disease. Let's see if it works for this one. So I don't believe the people who say that it hasn't been tried enough. In fact, I've seen it tried a lot. That's the question. Has it been tried enough? And so the thing is, I expect noise in the data. I expect there to be a few studies that seem to find efficacy, but when you look at them, they fall apart because they're too small or they're administered in a weird way or you don't see the evidence of it. And remember that we've got to think probabilistically with these. And that goes for good news as well as bad news. There's a famous quote. This is my favorite quote from a movie I've never seen, Dumb and Dumber. 1 in a million chances that you'll go out with me. So you're saying there's a chance. We're always saying there's a chance, but a 1 in a million chance, I don't want to hang my hat on a drug like that. So, and realize that even a high probability in a single study can be spurious. You have to look at 20 studies to be able to see the trends for all 20 studies. For example, a common level of significance for a study is that the results will be called significant if there's a 95% probability that the results are not from chance. That's great. That sounds really high, right? But look at it another way. If you ran 20 studies and there's a 1 out of 20 chance, each of them, there's a 19 out of 20 chance, 95% out of 100, that the study's right. That means there's a 1 out of 20 chance that the study's wrong. And that means that out of 20 studies, the likelihood is that one of them is wrong. So if we're running 20 drug studies on hydroxychloroquine and, one of them works but 19 don't, it could very well have valid data with a 95% chance of probability. That chance could be right, and it could be telling you this is the 1 in 20 that just rolled the dice and got the answer that's not true. This is a little bit of a fine point, and I don't really have time to go through the statistics too much on this, but I'll try to find another way. If this doesn't stick with you, I'll try to find another way to explain it. The basic solution is, if 1 out of 20 studies is wrong, well, look at 40 studies. If a small study could be wrong, a bigger study is more likely to be right. And there's a really big study that looked at a bunch of things, including hydroxychloroquine. It's called the Recovery Trial. Stands for Randomized Evaluation of COVID-19 Therapy. It comes from the UK, and you can tell because they say randomized with an S. And it's a really big study where they took several different treatments and they randomly assigned them to COVID patients. And they did that to a lot of COVID patients. So we actually have a lot of information. This is what came out when they were just planning the study, Nature Biotechnology, and it gives you the things that they tried. They tried an HIV drug. If it works against the HIV virus, it might work against coronavirus as well. They tried an anti-inflammatory steroid called dexamethasone. They tried hydroxychloroquine, and they tried an antibiotic called azithromycin. I'm not a doctor, so I just read these things. They're randomized, and there's a bunch of patients. They're not double-blind. So realize that, yeah, there could be better things, but I think the size of the study and the fact that they're trying 4 different things, they don't really have all their eggs in one basket, which is really the smart way to go. So here's the line for hydroxychloroquine. On this graph is showing mortality percentage. Higher is worse, lower is better. Hydroxychloroquine is the red line. More people died on hydroxychloroquine than had the usual care. It's really close, but it's probably significant. And even if it's not significant, it means there's no difference. You can see the numbers of patients, by the way, on the bottom of the graph. So you can see we're not talking about 100 patients. We're talking about thousands. So I don't want to leave you with that. I told you that they tried other things. So they tried hydroxychloroquine. They didn't find good results. But they tried dexamethasone, and they saw this for all participants. The red line is below the black line. It looks like it's saving lives. And if you look at the patients that are worse off, the patients that are on oxygen only or invasive ventilation, those do even better. In fact, that curve, I was so happy when I saw that curve on the right for the first time. Ventilated patients, you get almost a 15% increase. They go down from 40% of them dying to 25% of them dying. And you can see the numbers. The numbers are in the hundreds. So this is, for patients this severely impacted, this is a big number relative to the other studies. This looks like dexamethasone is working. But one caveat, one warning. Here's the graph for no oxygen received. If you look at that first graph of all patients, by the way, you might say to yourself, well, if it's so good for these worse off patients, then why is the line not that good, not as good for all patients? Well, the reason is, if you give dexamethasone to those that are not receiving oxygen at all, you actually have slightly higher mortality. This shows you that steroids are impacting a complex system. They're affecting immunity, they're affecting all sorts of things in the body, and different people can have different reactions at different stages. It looks like the evidence is, don't give dexamethasone early, but do give it late. And I'm feeling like, from looking at this, that the evidence is pretty solid for that. Now, the other people have asked, okay, so won't you let us try anything? Hydroxychloroquine, I've heard about this other doctor, and there's another doctor that I've heard about who gave a different inhaled steroid to other patients, and he says that it worked really well for them. Well, actually, when I hear that story, I have a lot better feeling than I do when I hear about hydroxychloroquine successes, because the doctor gave the patients a steroid. Dexamethasone's an inhaled steroid. Budesonide is also an inhaled steroid. You can see they even have similar shapes. Now, these are going to interact with the immune system and the complexities of the human body slightly differently. But budesonide deserves to be tried as much as dexamethasone did. And dexamethasone had a really good effect. It's a cheap drug that's already gone through several stages of approval. We know it's safe. We know the side effects. So let's try all of the inhaled steroids, in my opinion. But we need to try them with a lot of patients, and we need to see if they have something like dexamethasone, where you actually have a worse effect for one group of patients, but a much better effect for another group of patients. Okay. So the question of, is there anything to hydroxychloroquine? I'm afraid not. There might be some protective effect if you're taking it prophylactically. But I will believe that when I've seen it, and I haven't seen it. It seems like a dead end to me. And the other thing is, I have friends in hospitals who've tried all these things. I have a friend who's a pharmacist in Florida. He's tried this. He doesn't think it works. And I'm going to go with his experience and intuition. And I'm going to trust what he says more than any data, honestly. So inhaled steroids should be tried. So yes, I'm going to take away the possibility of hydroxychloroquine, at least as far as my opinion goes, which is not very far. But I am going to say, why not try inhaled steroids? Why not see if you get a similar effect? The other complexity to this, there's a paper, I might go over this paper in a podcast someday. It's great. It's by Akiko Iwasaki, who does great work in immunology. And her group found that there are 3 different types of immune responses to COVID. And it's possible that the inhaled steroid that works for you might depend on the type of response as well as the progression of the disease. So if you imagine you have like 3 stages of disease and 3 types of patients, you immediately have 9 categories that you have to figure out what drug works best for what person at what time, right? This is complex, and that's why we have to try things that the single doctor says, I treated a patient and they got better. Okay, let's try it. Let's try it in a randomized way with thousands of patients. I'm not going to believe what one person says unless I know that person personally and I can judge what their judgment is. And the whole point of clinical trials is that science gives us a framework to test these things, to test these trials, and to say, are you really saying something good here? Hydroxychloroquine has been unfairly maligned. I have tried not to do that. Looking at it the way I do, my answer is it looks like a dead end to me. Go ahead and take it prophylactically if you do it safely and under a doctor's supervision to make sure that the side effects don't get you. So all that's to say, if you asked a question, and I answered it. I have one more question, and I'm going to answer that next time.